Chapter 9, Part 2 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 9, Down an Unknown River into the Equatorial Forest. Part 2. All next day was spent by Lyra in superintending our three best watermen as they took the canoes down the west side of the rapids, to the foot, at the spot to which the camp had meantime been shifted. In the forest some of the huge cepas, or rope vines, which were as big as cables, bore clusters of fragrant flowers. The men found several honey trees, and fruits of various kinds, and small coconuts. They chopped down an ample number of palms for the palm cabbage, and most important of all, they gathered a quantity of big Brazil nuts, which when roasted tasted like the best of chestnuts and are nutritious. And they caught a number of big piranhas, which were good eating. So we all had a feast, and everybody had enough to eat, and was happy. By these rapids, at the fall, Cherrie found some strange carvings on a bare mass of rock. They were evidently made by men a long time ago. As far as is known, the Indians thereabouts make no such figures now. They were in two groups, one on the surface of the rock facing the land, the other on that facing the water. The latter were nearly obliterated. The former were in good preservation, the figures sharply cut into the rock. They consisted, upon the upper flat part of the rock, of 4 multiple circles with a dot in the middle, O, very accurately made, and about 1.5 feet in diameter, and below them, on the side of the rock, 4 multiple M's, or inverted W's. M. What these curious symbols represented, or who made them, we could not, of course, form the slightest idea. It may be that in a very remote past some Indian tribes of comparatively advanced culture had penetrated to this lovely river, just as we had now come to it. Before white men came to South America, there had already existed therein various semi-civilizations, some rude, others fairly advanced, which rose, flourished, and persisted through immemorial ages, and then vanished. The vicissitudes in the history of humanity during its stay on this southern continent have been as strange, varied, and inexplicable as paleontology shows to have been the case, on the same continent, in the history of the higher forms of animal life during the age of mammals. Colonel Rondon stated that such figures as these are not found anywhere else in Mato Grosso, where he has been, and therefore it was all the more strange to find them in this one place on the unknown river, never before visited by white men, which we were descending. Next morning we went about 3 kilometers before coming to some steep hills, beautiful to look upon, clad as they were in dense, tall, tropical forest, but ominous of new rapids. Sure enough, at their foot we had to haul up and prepare for a long portage. The canoes we ran down empty. Even so, we were within an ace of losing 2, the lashed couple in which I ordinarily journeyed. In a sharp bend of the rapids, between 2 big curls, they were swept among the boulders and under the matted branches which stretched out from the bank. They filled, and the racing current pinned them where they were, one partly on the other. All of us had to help get them clear. Their fastenings were chopped asunder with axes. Kermit and 6 of the men, stripped to the skin, made their way to a small rock island in the little falls just above the canoes, and let down a rope which we tied to the outermost canoe. The rest of us, up to our armpits and barely able to keep our footing as we slipped and stumbled among the boulders in the swift current, lifted and shoved while Kermit and his men pulled the rope and fastened the slack to a half-submerged tree. Each canoe in succession was hauled up the little rock island, bailed, and then taken down in safety by 2 paddlers. It was nearly 4 o'clock before we were again ready to start, having been delayed by a rainstorm so heavy that we could not see across the river. 10 minutes' run took us to the head of another series of rapids. The exploring party returned with the news that we had an all-day's job ahead of us, and we made camp in the rain, which did not matter much, as we were already drenched through. It was impossible with the wet wood to make a fire sufficiently hot to dry all our soggy things, for the rain was still falling. A tapir was seen from our boat, but, as at the moment we were being whisked round in a complete circle by a whirlpool, I did not myself see it in time to shoot. Next morning we went down a kilometre, then landed on the other side of the river. The canoes were run down, and the loads carried to the other side of a little river coming in from the west, which Colonel Rondon christened Cherry River. Across this we went on a bridge consisting of a huge tree felled by Macario, one of our best men. Here we camped, while Rondon, Lyra, Kermit, and Antonio Correa explored what was ahead. They were absent until mid-afternoon. Then they returned with the news that we were among ranges of low mountains, utterly different in formation from the high plateau region to which the first rapids, those we had come to on the 2nd of March, belonged. Through the first range of these mountains the river ran in a gorge, some 3 kilometres long, immediately ahead of us. The ground was so rough and steep that it would be impossible to drag the canoes over it, and difficult enough to carry the loads; and the rapids were so bad, containing several falls, one of at least 10 meters in height, that it was doubtful how many of the canoes we could get down them. Kermit, who was the only man with much experience of rope work, was the only man who believed we could get the canoes down at all, and it was, of course, possible that we should have to build new ones at the foot to supply the place of any that were lost or left behind. In view of the length and character of the portage, and of all the unpleasant possibilities that were ahead, and of the need of keeping every pound of food, it was necessary to reduce weight in every possible way, and to throw away everything except the barest necessities. We thought we had reduced our baggage before, but now we cut to the bone. We kept the fly for all 6 of us to sleep under. Kermit's shoes had gone, thanks to the amount of work in the water which he had been doing, and he took the pair I had been wearing, while I put on my spare pair. In addition to the clothes I wore, I kept 1 set of pajamas, a spare pair of drawers, a spare pair of socks, 6 handkerchiefs, my wash kit, my pocket medicine case, and a little bag containing my spare spectacles, gun grease, some adhesive plaster, some needles and thread, the fly dope, and my purse and letter of credit, to be used at Manaos. All of these went into the bag containing my cot, blanket, and mosquito net. I also carried a cartridge bag containing my cartridges, head net, and gauntlets. Kermit cut down even closer, and the others about as close. The last 3 days of March we spent in getting to the foot of the rapids in this gorge. Lyra and Kermit, with 4 of the best watermen, handled the empty canoes. The work was not only difficult and laborious in the extreme, but hazardous, for the walls of the gorge were so sheer that at the worst places they had to cling to narrow shelves on the face of the rock, while letting the canoes down with ropes. Meanwhile Rondon surveyed and cut a trail for the burden-bearers, and superintended the portage of the loads. The rocky sides of the gorge were too steep for laden men to attempt to traverse them. Accordingly, the trail had to go over the top of the mountain, both the ascent and the descent of the rock-strewn, forest-clad slopes being very steep. It was hard work to carry loads over such a trail. From the top of the mountain, through an opening in the trees on the edge of a cliff, there was a beautiful view of the country ahead. All around and in front of us there were ranges of low mountains, about the height of the lower ridges of the Alleghanies. Their sides were steep, and they were covered with the matted growth of the tropical forest. Our next camping place, at the foot of the gorge, was almost beneath us, and from thence the river ran in a straight line, flecked with white water, for about a kilometre. Then it disappeared behind and between mountain ridges, which we supposed meant further rapids. It was a view well worth seeing. But, beautiful although the country ahead of us was, its character was such as to promise further hardships, difficulty, and exhausting labour, and especially further delay. And delay was a serious matter to men whose food supply was beginning to run short, whose equipment was reduced to the minimum, who for a month with the utmost toil had made very slow progress, and who had no idea of either the distance or the difficulties of the route in front of them. There was not much life in the woods, big or little. Small birds were rare, although Cherrie's unwearied efforts were rewarded from time to time by a species new to the collection. There were tracks of tapir, deer, and agouti, and if we had taken 2 or 3 days to devote to nothing else than hunting them, we might perchance have killed something. But the chance was much too uncertain, the work we were doing was too hard and wearing, and the need of pressing forward altogether too great to permit us to spend any time in such manner. The hunting had to come in incidentally. This type of well-nigh impenetrable forest is the one in which it is most difficult to get even what little game exists therein. A couple of curassows and a big monkey were killed by the Colonel and Kermit. On the day the monkey was brought in, Lyra, Kermit, and their 4 associates had spent from sunrise to sunset in severe and at moments dangerous toil among the rocks and in the swift water, and the fresh meat was appreciated. The head, feet, tail, skin, and entrails were boiled for the gaunt and ravenous dogs. The flesh gave each of us a few mouthfuls, and how good those mouthfuls tasted! Cherrie, in addition to being out after birds in every spare moment, helped in all emergencies. He was a veteran in the work of the tropic wilderness. We talked together often and of many things, for our views of life, and of a man's duty to his wife and children, to other men and to women, and to the state in peace and war, were in all essentials the same. His father had served all through the Civil War, entering an Iowa cavalry regiment as a private, and coming out as a captain. His breastbone was shattered by a blow from a musket butt, in hand-to-hand fighting at Shiloh. During this portage the weather favoured us. We were coming toward the close of the rainy season. On the last day of the month, when we moved camp to the foot of the gorge, there was a thunderstorm, but on the whole we were not bothered by rain until the last night, when it rained heavily, driving under the fly so as to wet my cot and bedding. However, I slept comfortably enough, rolled in the damp blanket. Without the blanket I should have been uncomfortable. A blanket is a necessity for health. On the 3rd day, Lyra and Kermit, with their daring and hard-working watermen, after wearing labour, succeeded in getting 5 canoes through the worst of the rapids to the chief fall. The 6th, which was frail and weak, had its bottom beaten out on the jagged rocks of the broken water. On this night, although I thought I had put my clothes out of reach, both the termites and the Corregidorus ants got at them, ate holes in one boot, ate one leg of my drawers, and riddled my handkerchief. And I now had nothing to replace anything that was destroyed. Next day Lyra, Kermit, and their camaradas brought the 5 canoes that were left down to camp. They had in 4 days accomplished a work of incredible labour and of the utmost importance, for at the first glance it had seemed an absolute impossibility to avoid abandoning the canoes, when we found that the river sank into a cataract-broken torrent at the bottom of a canyon-like gorge between steep mountains. On April 2nd we once more started wondering how soon we should strike other rapids in the mountains ahead, and whether in any reasonable time we should, as the aneroid indicated, be so low down that we should necessarily be in a plain where we could make a journey of at least a few days without rapids. We had been exactly a month going through an uninterrupted succession of rapids. During that month we had come only about 110 kilometres, and had descended nearly 150 metres. The figures are approximate, but fairly accurate. We had lost 4 of the canoes with which we started, and 1 other which we had built, and the life of 1 man, and the life of a dog, which by its death had in all probability saved the life of Colonel Rondon. In a straight line northward, toward our supposed destination, we had not made more than 1.25 miles a day. At the cost of bitter toil for most of the party, of much risk for some of the party, and of some risk and some hardship for all the party. Most of the camaradas were downhearted, naturally enough, and occasionally asked one of us if we really believed that we should ever get out alive, and we had to cheer them up as best we could. There was no change in our work for the time being. We made but 3 kilometers that day. Most of the party walked all the time, but the dugouts carried the luggage until we struck the head of the series of rapids which were to take up the next 2 or 3 days. The river rushed through a wild gorge, a chasm or canyon between two mountains. Its sides were very steep, mere rock walls, although in most places so covered with the luxuriant growth of the trees and bushes that clung in the crevices, and with green moss, that the naked rock was hardly seen. Rondon, Lyra, and Kermit, who were in front, found a small level spot, with a beach of sand, and sent back word to camp there, while they spent several hours in exploring the country ahead. The canoes were run down empty, and the loads carried painfully along the face of the cliffs. So bad was the trail that I found it rather hard to follow, although carrying nothing but my rifle and cartridge bag. The explorers returned with the information that the mountains stretched ahead of us, and that there were rapids as far as they had gone. We could only hope that the aneroid was not hopelessly out of kilter, and that we should, therefore, fairly soon find ourselves in comparatively level country. The severe toil, on a rather limited food supply, was telling on the strength as well as on the spirits of the men. Lyra and Kermit, in addition to their other work, performed as much actual physical labor as any of them. End of Chapter 9, Part 2.